We begin, as we always do, with a plain truth. She was 43 years old, and by the spring of 1897, she had nothing left to her name but a tin trunk, a black morning dress gone gray at the seams, and $38 folded into a handkerchief. Her name was Augusta Pruitt, though most called her Gus, and she had been cast out of the only home she'd known for 11 years by her late husband's brother, a man named Warwick Pruitt, who told the whole of Larkspur, Arizona Territory, that a widow had no business running a freight company built by men. He said it kindly, the way a man says a cruel thing when he wants witnesses to remember his kindness rather than his cruelty. With that money, that trunk, and nothing else, Augusta walked to the county auction house on a Tuesday morning and bid on the one lot no other soul in town would touch, an abandoned narrow-gauge spur line called the Sable Wash Railroad, along with its crumbling depot house, sold for back taxes at $15 because everyone in Larkspur agreed on one thing. That railroad went nowhere. It simply stopped 40 miles out in the open desert at nothing anyone had ever found. They called her a fool for buying it. They did not know that sealed behind the depot's baggage room wall was a secret that would not only change the rest of Augusta Pruitt's life, but restore to an entire vanished town, the home the world had told them did not exist. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Augusta Pruitt. If you have ever felt forgotten by the place that was supposed to hold you, tell us in the comments. We would love to know where you're watching from tonight. Augusta had not always been a woman with $38 to her name. She had been raised outside Silver City, New Mexico Territory, the daughter of a Welsh stonemason named Idris Bevan and a mother, Ruth, who kept the ledgers for half the ranches in the valley, because she was the only person for 40 miles who could add a column of figures without losing count past the hundreds. It was from her mother that Augusta learned the two things that would carry her through the whole of her life: how to read a document the way a hawk reads a field, missing nothing, and how to believe that a thing's worth was never quite what its price tag said. Her father used to tell her, laying stone after stone into a wall that would outlast them both, that a good foundation was invisible, that the strongest things in the world were the ones nobody thought to look at twice. She married Elias Pruitt at 19, a freighter's son with kind eyes and rough hands, and together they built the Pruitt Overland Company into the most trusted hauling outfit between Tucson and the Gila River, carrying mail, lumber, medicine, and mercy in equal measure to towns too small and too poor for anyone else to bother with. Augusta kept the books, same as her mother had, and more than once she caught an error that would have bankrupted them, and more than once she extended credit to a rancher or a widow that Elias would never have thought to offer, because she remembered what her mother always said, that the ledger tells you what a man owes, but it does not tell you what he's worth. She had no children of her own, a grief she carried quietly, folded the way she folded everything painful in as small shapes she could carry without breaking. Instead, she poured herself into the company, into the drivers who came to her for advice, into the town of Larkspur itself, teaching Sunday letters to children whose parents could not read, keeping accounts for the church poor fund without ever once taking credit for it. She was, by every account that mattered, a woman who built quietly and gave generously, and she believed, the way honest people often do, that decency was its own kind of insurance against ruin. She would learn, in time, that it was not, but she would also learn that it was never wasted, either. Elias Pruitt died in the winter of 1895, thrown from a wagon during a flash flood on the Cienega Road, and it was in the 18 months that followed that Augusta discovered exactly how little her decency had insured her against. Warwick, Elias's younger brother, had always resented that Augusta kept the books, that drivers came to her with their troubles, that his brother trusted a woman's judgment over his own blustering certainty. Within a year of the funeral, Warwick had convinced the territorial court, using papers Augusta would later understand were not entirely honest, that the company's charter had always belonged to the Pruitt family name and not to any widow married into it, regardless of the years she'd spent keeping it solvent. The judge, an old friend of Warwick's from a lodge hall in Tucson, signed the transfer without much scrutiny. Augusta was given, in exchange for 11 years of labor and every dollar of her own savings that had gone into the company's growth, exactly $200 in a request, gently but firmly delivered, that she vacate the house behind the depot within a month. She did not fight in court because she did not have the money to fight it, and because she had watched enough ledgers in her life to know that a fight against a rigged column of figures rarely balances in the honest party's favor. She sold what furniture she could, paid what debts remained in her name out of principle rather than obligation. And by the time she boarded the coach out of what had been her home, she had $38 folded into a handkerchief in a tin trunk that held the whole of what remained of Augusta Pruitt's life. Her mother's account books, her father's masonry level, 3 dresses, and a small brass compass Elias had given her the year they married. She did not weep on that coach, not because she wasn't broken, but because she had learned from a mother who balanced other people's ruin for a living that grief spent too loudly is grief wasted on people who will not remember it. She rode 2 days south into a stretch of the territory she barely knew, and she got off in a rail town because the coach happened to stop there, and because $38, she reasoned, would not go much further no matter which direction she pointed it. The town was called Larkspur, though not the same Larkspur. This one sat in the Arizona Territory proper, a dusty rail and cattle settlement built around a water tank and a saloon, the kind of place that existed because the railroad needed to stop every so many miles, and this happened to be the spot where the desert allowed it. It was there, on her second morning, restless and unwilling to spend even a coin on a room she did not strictly need, that Augusta wandered down to the county courthouse steps and found a crowd gathered for the monthly tax auction, the sale of properties abandoned or forfeited for lack of payment. Most of the lots were what you'd expect. A burned-out livery, a half-built church, 40 acres of scrub nobody wanted. But it was the last lot of the morning that drew the loudest laughter from the crowd, because the auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Corbin Teague, read it out with visible relish. The Sable Wash Spur, 6 miles of narrow-gauge track running due west out of Larkspur, along with its depot house, sold as one unbroken lot, opening bid $5. Someone in the crowd hollered that the railroad went nowhere, that it had been built 20 years prior by a mining outfit that folded before it ever laid track past the 6-mile marker, and that the depot itself had stood empty and unclaimed since before most of the men present had settled in the territory. Teague agreed, laughing along, and said that as far as anyone could tell, the tracks simply stopped in the middle of the desert and led to nothing at all, which was, he said, a fitting description of the man who'd have to be foolish enough to buy it. Augusta stood at the back of that crowd with her handkerchief of coins and thought of her father, laying stone after invisible stone, telling her that the strongest things were the ones nobody thought to look at twice. She raised her hand and bid $5. Nobody challenged her past 10. She paid 15, the whole transaction taking less time than it takes to boil an egg, and walked away owning a railroad that, by universal agreement, led nowhere at all. The depot house sat a half-mile outside town proper, a squat clapboard building with a sagging porch roof and a ticket window boarded over so long the wood had silvered gray, and when Augusta pushed open its door for the first time, the hinges shrieked as if in protest of being disturbed after 2 decades of silence. Dust lay thick over everything. A ticket counter, a cold iron stove, a wall of pigeonhole shelving still holding a few brittle timetables for a line that had never run trains long enough to need them. She spent that first afternoon simply sweeping, because sweeping was a thing she knew how to do with her hands while her mind worked out what precisely she had done, and it was in sweeping the baggage room at the rear of the depot that she noticed the wall did not sit quite true. The other 3 walls of the room showed the honest were of 20 years, sun-faded, water-stained near the floorboards. But the 4th wall, the one backing onto what should have been open desert, looked newer beneath its grime, its boards slightly narrower than the others, its nails a different gauge entirely from the rest of the building. Her father's voice came to her clear, as if he stood beside her. A good foundation is invisible, but a bad seam always shows itself to a careful eye. She worked at the boards with a pry bar she found rusting behind the stove, and after the better part of an hour, one panel came free to reveal, set into the depot's actual back wall, a small iron door no larger than a cellar hatch, secured with a padlock gone orange with rust, but not yet broken. It took her the rest of the daylight and the strength of both hands wrapped around the pry bar, to snap that lock. And when the door finally swung open on hinges that had clearly been oiled sometime in the last 20 years by someone who intended to return, she found, resting on a low shelf inside a space no bigger than a wardrobe, a strong box of dark walnut, a leather-bound ledger, and a rolled canvas map tied with a ribbon that had once been blue. She did not open the ledger that first night, though every instinct in her told her to. Instead, she sat with it in her lap by lantern light, running her thumb along its spine the way her mother used to before opening any book of accounts, as if giving the numbers inside a moment to settle before they were disturbed. When at last she opened it, she found not a record of freight and fares, as she'd expected from a railroad ledger, but something stranger, column after column of names, dates, and a single word repeated beside nearly every entry, delivered. Some names she recognized as common enough: Chun, Alvarez, Freeman, Toya, and beside each was noted a sum of money, always modest, always marked paid in full or forgiven, alongside a destination that appeared nowhere on any territorial map she had ever seen, a place called Solace. The final page of the ledger, dated some 22 years prior, bore a single signature beneath a short, careful paragraph, written in an engineer's precise hand, describing the Sable Wash Line not as a mining spur that had failed, but as a project completed exactly as intended, its true terminus never meant to appear on any survey filed with the territory. The signature read Obadiah Rourke, engineer founder. Augusta sat a long while with that page open on her knees, the lantern guttering low, and understood, with a particular quiet certainty that comes to a person who has spent her whole life reading what documents refuse to say outright, that the railroad she had bought for $15 did not go nowhere at all. It went somewhere the world had been very deliberately kept from finding. The map, when she finally unrolled it, confirmed what the ledger had only implied: 6 miles of track running due west from the Larkspur Depot, exactly as everyone believed, but where the official surveys showed the line simply terminating in open scrubland. Rourke's map continued, in fainter ink, another 34 miles through a dry wash and a stand of hills that did not appear on any territorial chart Augusta had ever seen filed at a land office, ending a shaded green oval labeled in the same careful hand as the ledger's final entry, Solace. She spent 3 days preparing before she followed it, patching a handcart she found rusting in the depot's tool shed to run the narrow gauge, filling 2 canteens, packing what dried meat and hardtack her remaining dollars could still afford. And on the 4th morning, she pumped that handcart west along tracks so overgrown with creosote and mesquite that she had to stop every quarter mile to clear the rails by hand. 6 miles out, exactly as the town had always said, the rails ended in a tangle of rust and sand, and for one long, terrible moment Augusta feared the whole of it. The ledger, the map, the hidden door, was nothing more than an old man's private fantasy, a dead end as literal as the one everyone in Larkspur had already laughed about. But she had her father's compass and her mother's patience, and she walked on foot, following the faint, deliberate cairns of stacked stone that appeared every quarter mile once the rails gave out, stones placed with a purpose no wind or weather had managed to erase in 20 years. And just past noon on the 2nd day, she crested a low ridge of red rock and looked down into a valley that, by every map the territory had ever printed, did not exist. It was not large, perhaps 40 families' worth of homes, adobe and timber both, arranged around a spring-fed creek that ran green through cottonwoods in a country where green was itself a kind of miracle. But it was whole, and it was lived in, smoke rising from chimneys, chickens scratching in dooryards, a schoolhouse bell ringing faintly on the afternoon air. Augusta stood on that ridge for a long while before she found the courage to walk down, and when she did, she was met on the road by a broad-shouldered man with iron-gray hair and skin weather-dark by decades of desert sun, who introduced himself, with the wary courtesy of a man used to strangers meaning trouble, as Isaiah Freeman, and who told her, once she'd explained the ledger and the depot and the $15, that Solace had been founded exactly the way its name suggested, as a refuge. In the years after the territory's removal statutes had targeted freed families, Chinese laborers displaced by the exclusion raids, and Apache families forced from ancestral land by shifting reservation lines. A Quaker railroad engineer named Obadiah Rourke had used a failed mining company's charter as cover to build a spur line that officially went nowhere, so that it could quietly, secretly, carry anyone in danger of losing their home to a valley hidden from every survey the territory ever filed. He had never claimed the land his own name, Isaiah explained, because a claim filed would have been a claim discovered, and discovery was the one thing Solace could not survive. He had died 11 years back, and the town he'd built had simply gone on living, self-sufficient, careful, and utterly unrecorded, trusting that the desert's own vastness would keep them safe the way official paperwork never could. It should have ended there, a quiet mystery solved and a debt of gratitude paid. But the world outside Solace's hidden valley had not stood still while its people lived their careful, unmapped lives, and Augusta learned within the month exactly how little safety a hidden place could count on once someone with money and motive came looking for what lay beneath it. Word had begun to travel, not of Solace itself, which remained as invisible as ever, but of the reopened Sable Wash Depot, of a widow pumping a handcart 6 miles into the desert and returning each time with a look on her face that men like Warwick Pruitt, who had followed her south out of a mixture of guilt and unfinished business regarding the company he'd stolen, found deeply, profitably suspicious. Warwick had partnered, in the 18 months since the transfer of the freight company, with a land speculator out of Prescott named Dade Holloway, a man who made his fortune buying up territorial grazing rights and mineral claims on land the government considered unclaimed, and who had recently set his sights on precisely the stretch of desert hills that hid Solace's spring, a spring that, properly developed, could water cattle across 40,000 acres currently too dry to lease. Holloway did not know the valley existed. Not yet, but he knew that whoever held the abandoned Sable Wash right-of-way held the only legal access route through hills the territory surveys had never properly charted, and when Warwick told him a foolish widow had bought that right-of-way for $15, Holloway saw not a fool's purchase, but an obstacle standing squarely between his money and a fortune in water rights. They came to the depot together on a bright, windless morning in early June, Warwick doing most of the talking while Holloway stood with his thumbs in his vest pockets and let his silence do the intimidating, and they offered Augusta $300 for the Sable Wash lot in its entirety, an offer so far above what she'd paid that any sensible woman with $38 to her name might have taken it without a second thought. Augusta did not take it, and when Warwick's tone shifted from persuasive to threatening, reminding her, with the particular cruelty of a man who believes the law is simply an extension of his own convenience, that a widow's claim to any property could be challenged in territorial court the same way her claim to the freight company had been, she understood exactly what kind of fight she had stumbled into, and exactly how little standing a $15 tax auction receipt would provide against men who had already proven themselves willing to bend a judge's ear. She told them she needed time to consider it, which was, in its way, the first outright falsehood Augusta Pruitt had told in a very long time, because she had already decided, standing in that dusty depot with Rourke's ledger hidden beneath a floorboard behind her, that she would rather lose everything a second time than hand Holloway a road into a valley built on the promise that no road would ever find it. She rode into town that same afternoon and found Isaiah Freeman at the Sala schoolhouse, and together with the town's small council. A former Buffalo soldier named Marcus Toya, who had married into an Apache family displaced by the reservation lines. A Chinese herbalist named Mei Chun, whose grandfather's name appeared 3 times in Rourke's ledger. And an elderly seamstress named Constance Alvarez, who remembered Rourke himself arriving with the first families in a borrowed freight wagon. Augusta laid out the whole danger plainly, the way her mother had taught her to lay out any ledger, without softening the sum. Holloway's claim, if filed, would not simply threaten the valley's privacy. Territorial water law favored whoever filed first and filed formally, and an unrecorded, unincorporated settlement, however long-standing, however deserving, had no legal footing at all against a speculator with money for lawyers and a friendly judge in his pocket. What Solace needed, Augusta told them, was not secrecy any longer, but proof. proof filed properly in the town's own name before Holloway's lawyers could file a competing claim on land the territory still considered empty. It was Constance who remembered, then, that Rourke had spoken once, near the end of his life, of a second document beyond the ledger. A formal petition for incorporation he had drafted but never filed, fearful that filing it would draw exactly the attention that had, for 2 decades, kept Solace safe. If such a document existed, and if it named the valley's boundaries and its founding date clearly enough, it might yet serve as the very proof the town needed, provided someone could find it, and provided someone was willing to carry it into a land office where a woman's word, let alone a hidden town's, would not easily be believed. Augusta found the petition 3 nights later, in the same walnut strongbox that had held the ledger, tucked beneath a false bottom she discovered only because her father's masonry training had taught her that a careful builder never wastes hidden space. And beneath the paper lay something else Rourke had left behind, a modest cache of mining shares from the original failed company, worthless as or but, buried in the fine print of the original 1874 Charter. Augusta now understood well enough to read twice, still legally entitling their holder to the right-of-way and water access the company had originally surveyed, the very right-of-way she now owned outright through her $15 purchase. It was, she realized, sitting again by lantern light with the whole tangled inheritance spread across her lap, precisely the kind of overlooked, undervalued thing her father had always told her to look for, a illegal foothold nobody else had thought worth claiming, because nobody else had thought to look twice at a railroad that went nowhere. She rode for Prescott within the week, the petition, the ledger, and the mining charter wrapped carefully in oilcloth inside her tin trunk, and she filed at the Territorial Land Office, not a claim of her own, but an act of incorporation for the township of Solace, its boundaries drawn precisely along Rourke's original 1874 survey, its water rights secured under the very charter Holloway's own lawyers would later discover, to their considerable dismay, predated any claim they could possibly file. The clerk who processed the paperwork did not know he was making history that afternoon. He only knew that the fees were paid correctly and the documents were, unusually for a woman filing alone, in flawless order. Warwick Pruitt did not take the news well when it reached Larkspur that autumn, and in his fury he made the single error that would finally, fully undo him. He wrote a letter to the territorial court demanding that Augusta's incorporation filing be voided on the grounds that she was, as he put it, a woman of no independent legal standing, still bound in some fashion to the Pruitt family estate she had once been part of. The letter was intended to intimidate. Instead, because it was filed as an official court document, it drew precisely the kind of careful, unhurried legal scrutiny that Warwick's own transfer of the freight company had spent 2 years successfully avoiding, and it was a junior clerk in that same Prescott office, cross-referencing the Pruitt name out of simple procedural thoroughness, who noticed that the notarization on Warwick's original 1896 transfer papers bore the signature of a notary who had, by the court's own records, died 4 months before that document was supposedly signed. What followed was not swift. Territorial law rarely moved swiftly for anyone, let alone a widow with no money for lawyers. But it was in the end sure the way a good foundation laid true eventually outlasts every crooked wall built without one. The freight company's transfer was voided within the year, the original charter restored to Elias Pruitt's rightful widow, and Warwick, facing formal fraud charges he could not talk his way out of with a friendly judge's signature this time, left the territory entirely rather than face trial. His partnership with Dade Holloway, dissolving the moment Holloway realized the man had been offering him, as collateral for their doomed water rights scheme, land he'd never legally owned in the first place. Solace did not disappear once its town was mapped and its papers filed. If anything, it became more fully itself, because for the first time in 20 years, its people no longer had to hold their breath each time a stranger's shadow crossed the ridge. The spring was developed carefully under the town's own control, sharing water not with Holloway's cattle but with Larkspur itself, whose own well had been running low for years, and the 6 miles of narrow-gauge track that everyone once swore led nowhere were relayed, board by board, rail by rail, by townsfolk from both settlements working side by side, until the whistle of a small engine, second-hand, secured with what remained of the Pruitt Company's restored assets, could be heard rolling west out of Larkspur toward a town that had finally, after 2 decades, earned the right to appear on a map without fear of what that appearance might cost it. Augusta Pruitt did not take a grand title for herself in any of it. She asked only to be named the depot's station master, a modest post, though everyone in both towns understood it to mean something larger, that she was the keeper of the seam between 2 worlds. The invisible foundation stone her father had always told her mattered more than anything built in plain sight. And so we return, as we promised, to where we began, to a 43-year-old widow standing at a county auction with $38 folded in her handkerchief, bidding on a railroad the whole town swore led nowhere. It is easy, hearing a story end in restoration, to forget how it felt at its beginning, when Augusta Pruitt had nothing but a tin trunk and her mother's stubborn belief that worth is rarely printed on the price tag. She did not buy that depot because she saw a hidden town waiting inside it. She bought it because a lifetime of reading ledgers had taught her that the things everyone else dismisses too quickly are very often the things holding the truest value, and because a woman who has been told her whole worth is nothing has a particular gift for recognizing when the world has made the same mistake about something else. What she found at the end of that 6-mile spur was never really gold or shares or legal leverage, though those things mattered greatly in the end. What she found was a town that had survived 20 years by believing, quietly and without proof, that it deserved to exist. And what she gave them, in the end, was simply the proof the world had always demanded but never bothered to offer on its own. Thank you for spending this evening with Augusta Pruitt and with the town of Solace, which we like to think still stands somewhere out past a ridge of red rock, its spring running green through the cottonwoods, its little engine still rolling west each morning along track that used to lead nowhere at all. If this story moved you, we'd be grateful if you shared it with someone who needed a reminder that overlooked things are not the same as worthless things. And before you go, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time you found real value in something the rest of the world had already written off? We read every answer, and we carry them with us the way Augusta carried her mother's ledgers, carefully and for a long time. Until next time, stay close.